Hello nature lovers, Bob Ellis here with another episode of Notes from the Field. And today we find ourselves in a most beautiful location, and that is the Grapevine Creek Special Botanical Area. And that is in the Bradshaw Mountains, in the Prescott National Forest, in the Mogollon Highlands, here in the central part of Arizona. And today we brought this beautiful location to you with another big idea that you might apply to your natural history. Before I jump into that, I want to mention a webinar that we hosted last night with Jane Hirschfield, the poet. I would recommend you checking out that YouTube video because it was profound. And she had a line in that video that struck me as very, very true for natural history. And she was speaking of poetry when she said, poetry is a stay against confusion. Boy, that really seems true. It rings true for me anyway about natural history. I can come to a place like this, and almost any place where I am outdoors, maybe it's an abandoned lot in the city or the neighborhood woods or a park, and suddenly being immersed in nature, I feel less confused. I feel more connected. So this special spot today, we're going to bring a big idea to you, and that big idea is about community structure. And we're talking about biological communities. And this biological community really fits the bill perfectly because we're kind of in an ecotone, or a place where a number of biological communities meet. And there's a lot of different ideas in community structure that we can introduce, but the big one that I want to introduce today is the idea of species diversity. And so, why don't you take a walk with me up this creek into the botanical area, and let's talk a little bit about species diversity, community structure, and how you can apply these ideas to your pursuit of natural history. A biological community is just simply a number of populations interacting. And so this biological community that we're walking through right here, I had mentioned that there are three that kind of converge in this location, which makes it a special botanical area. This biotic community is the interior riparian deciduous forest. And you can see this is one of the dominant species out here. And we'll come to the definition of dominant a little bit later on. And this is Arizona alder, Alnus oblongifolia. And you can see that this is a mature tree. So we've abandoned the creek and decided to walk in the uplands here. The creek is only about 20 meters down slope, and already you can see a tremendous change in the vegetation. We're walking through this beautiful little oak grove where there are deciduous oaks and evergreen oaks, and even some hybrids between the two. And as we walk along, I'd like to kind of invite you to think about your places with this big idea as a part of what you're looking at, and that is species diversity is made up of two elements. There's species richness, and then there's species evenness. And whenever you think of species diversity, you might think of species richness, the number of species in a particular area. That's just one element of species diversity. The other element, equally as important, is species evenness. And that just simply is the relative abundance of each species in the biotic community. One of the dominant species in this biotic community is this tree, ponderosa pine. But you also saw as we walked through that little oak grove that there are other species here. But in general, for this biotic community, this is the dominant tree. So why are we even concerned about or talking about dominance? Well, as you might have already kind of figured out, there's a relationship between dominance and diversity. The greater the dominance, the less the diversity. And that might give you a chance to apply this idea whenever you're in the places that you visit. So how does that work? Well, think of it this way. If you have 10 plants in a particular area, let's say 10 trees in a particular area, and there's one of those trees, there's, let's say, 100 of that particular species. And all the other species, there's only 1 or 2 trees of each one of those species. That's pretty clear that there's one dominant organism in that biotic community. If the situation were more diverse, it would look like this. There were 10 trees and an even number of all of those trees in that biotic community. And so there would be, let's say, 100 of tree 1, tree 2, 100, tree 3, 100. And so there's a mathematical formula that you can use to kind of figure out what is the diversity of a particular area. And it's basically a formula that looks at the species evenness and species richness. What is the measure of dominance? Well, that's pretty interesting because there's a lot of measures of dominance. Right now, Bob, you're telling us just the frequency of an organism appearing in the landscape indicates dominance. How about its biomass? How about its biological or ecological importance? That's another way to measure dominance. So there are different measures of dominance, but typically whenever I'm thinking about dominance when it comes to autotrophs or plants, I'm thinking about the amount of standing biomass. How much of that thing is there? How much of that thing is across the landscape? And so that's kind of delivers a foundation, if you will. As a matter of fact, you can think of these dominant species as foundational species. How much of that foundation is there? And if there's a lot of one organism, that organism more than likely is dominant. And of course, human perception is kind of oriented in certain directions, and so therefore, to do a real measure, you're going to have to start doing some counting. But this allows you to start thinking about the landscapes you move through maybe in a different way. And so hopefully that's helpful. We climbed up from the stream side and through the Pétron-Montane forest, and now we're in that other biotic community that I mentioned earlier, the chaparral. And down below us, you can see the outline of the creek traced by those trees that have those brown casts to them, and those are those Arizona alders, and that brownness on those trees are the male flowers, the catkins. They've already started flowering. And so you can kind of trace the path of the stream. And the reason that I wanted to bring you all up here was for 2 purposes. The first one being recognizing that the chaparral, a biotic community, sort of runs almost all the way down slope to the stream on this south-facing slope. However, if you look over on the north-facing slope, you'll see a tremendously different biotic community, and that is the Pétron-Montane conifer forest. So all 3 of these biotic communities converge here, and that's going to lend itself to some species diversity because there's both elements of richness and evenness in this location. The other thing that makes this a particularly species diverse area is the fact that there's plenty of environmental heterogeneity, and that's just a way of saying variability in the vertical stratification of the forest. There's a lot of different places where an organism can live, and remember that the master abiotic factors really are driving this whole landscape. And so whenever you think about a lot of different levels, think about a lot of different temperature and moisture gradients. So there's a lot of different opportunities for organisms to exploit, much more so than a place that has, or a biotic community that has limited kind of environmental heterogeneity or vertical variation. For example, if we look up slope at the chaparral, you do not see a whole lot of environmental heterogeneity. The shrubs reach one height, And you can see that a fire came through here a few years back and removed what heterogeneity there was, those juniper trees. And so this is going to limit the species diversity in this particular location. So as you can see behind me now that these three biotic communities kind of converge, and you can see the variation in environmental heterogeneity. So you can anticipate there's going to be some high species diversity here because there's both richness and evenness. I hope that this idea of species diversity and those two elements, you're able to take those two ideas, or take that idea and move into the places where you like to explore and apply them, see if it kind of enhances your pursuit of natural history. And as we get that nice view of the Colorado Plateau in the distance, I want to cast back to Jane Hirschfield and encourage you to find that stay on confusion in the places you love in nature. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.